Hello, my name is Andrea Summerell and I am the Executive Director for the Elections Division. The 2024 local government elections involve over 5.5 million electors and will be one of the biggest community events held in New South Wales in 2024. We established close to 300 pre-poll venues and around 2,200 polling places across New South Wales on election day. We also employ more than 20,000 people to assist in conducting the elections. Our webinars are intended to help registered political parties, candidates, scrutineers, and other political participants in the elections by explaining processes, procedures, and compliance obligations for the event. However, I must stress that the information we provide is not legal advice. If political participants are in doubt about any legal matters regarding the election, they should seek their own independent legal advice. I and everyone at the New South Wales Electoral Commission look forward to delivering the 2024 local government elections with transparency, integrity, fairness, and safety. I hope you find these webinars engaging, informative, and helpful.
Good morning and welcome to our Candidate Information webinar for counting and results for the upcoming New South Wales local government elections. My name's Amber King and I'm the Manager for Nominations and Electoral Material. And today I'm joined with Diana Kasefi, the Manager, Counting and Results. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we work today and the Aboriginal people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past and present and recognise the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. We will be using Slido to receive questions throughout today's webinar. Please join at slido.com and use hashtag #LGElections to ask your questions. We will be answering questions relevant to all participants throughout today's webinar. We will not be answering questions specific to an individual. In this instance, we do ask that you contact us directly. If you experience any technical difficulties, please SMS the number on the screen for assistance. The webinar today will cover election day activities, scrutineers, and counting and results. The webinar will be recorded and available on our website. The New South Wales Electoral Commission also has a candidate handbook available for participants on our website that will go into greater detail on each of these subjects for you. The New South Wales Electoral Commission will publish early voting cumulative daily totals on our website. Details published will include the daily totals on the number of electors who cast a vote during the early voting period. The total number of postal vote applications and the number of completed postal vote certificates returned will be published, and the attendance voting through the pre-poll period. The Department of Education has asked that posters do not be displayed at polling places prior to 4:30 p.m. this Friday. We do encourage you to discuss this with your candidate workers or people that may be assisting you with the display of your posters at schools. We also ask you to encourage your candidate workers or people who will be assisting to remove the posters at the end of voting on election day from all of our voting centres.
Now we can see on the screen the key dates and time for the counting and results timeline, which we will be discussing throughout this webinar. Polling places will be open on election day from 8 a.m. until 6 p.m. The locations of polling places and the projected number of votes for each venue are available on our website. Scrutineers play an important role in the election process. They represent the interest of candidates and observe that the procedures are being followed by election officials fairly, impartially, and with integrity. A scrutineer's presence provides an additional level of assurance to political participants and the public regarding the integrity of the election process. Scrutineers can only be appointed by a candidate and must be appointed in writing using the appointment of scrutineer form available on our website. An appointment must be shown on each occasion that a scrutineer attends a location. Scrutineers should be familiar with the scrutineer guidelines for scrutiny and counting and the scrutineer policy. These documents are available on our website and describe the role of scrutineers and aim to increase the understanding of scrutineers when observing election processes.
Scrutineers may observe all stages of voting, scrutiny and counting. They can inspect ballot boxes before the commencement of voting, witness the opening, operation and closing of polling places. They can observe telephone voting and observe the scrutiny of postal and declaration vote envelopes and the extraction of ballot papers from those envelopes. Scrutineers may observe the scrutiny and counting of ballot papers, including objecting to the formality of or the determination of preferences on a ballot paper. It is important to note that a scrutineer must accept the decision by the election official in charge. If the scrutineer is not satisfied with the decision, they should note the details of the ballot paper. Please note that if it is during an initial count, a final determination will be made at the check count. If it is during the check count, a candidate may pursue the matter through a recount request or ultimately legal action. Scrutineers cannot use mobile phones or other electronic equipment to film, photograph or record processes inside a voting centre. Scrutineers may use mobile phones inside a voting centre or one of these locations to talk to or text another person, as long as the noise level does not interfere with the processes being undertaken. Scrutineers cannot interfere with or attempt to influence any elector within a polling place, pre-poll or declared facility, interfere with or attempt to influence any election official within a polling place or ballot counting venue, distribute election material when accompanying election officials while visiting declared facilities, obstruct the access to a polling place, pre-poll venue or declared facility. A scrutineer who commits any breach of these requirements would be guilty of an offence. The schedule of counting and the location of each count for each area is now available on our website. Scrutineers can observe processes at polling places and pre-poll voting centres, the Returning Officer's Office, and centralised count centres, including the postal vote and declaration vote count centres, and our telephone-assisted voting centre. Each candidate may appoint one scrutineer to represent them to observe processes at each place at which polling is carried out. Ballot papers are scrutinised or votes are counted. A group can only appoint one scrutineer at any one place. A candidate will be permitted to appoint additional scrutineers so that one scrutineer per candidate is permitted per scrutiny point or counting point. Additional scrutiny numbers will vary for each venue, and we recommend you speak to the returning officer or polling place manager directly. As we've noted, we do have a number of resources available for scrutineers on our website, including the Scrutineer and Party Candidate Worker Guidelines, the Scrutineer Policy, there's the Scrutineer section of the Candidate Handbook, and we do encourage scrutineers to attend the briefing given by the election official in charge before a process begins. Scrutineers are also welcome to contact the Candidate Help Desk with any inquiries they may have.
Counting and results, Amber.
Counting and results.
This is the timeline for the count and the declaration of results. Again, we'll go through these topics in detail. Two main activities in counting, which are the initial count and the check count. The initial count is a manual process. This is the first count of all first preference votes only, conducted from election night onwards. This count is an indicative count. Then the check count. A check count or a second count of all the ballot papers is conducted after election day. The check count involves the data entry of preferences from every ballot paper. The results of the check count are considered to be the final count figures to be used in the distribution of preferences.
Now, election night. From 6 p.m. on election night, the initial count of mayor and councillor will be conducted for every polling place, some but not all pre-poll venues, some but not all postal ballot papers. Election night results will be published on the New South Wales Electoral Commission's website from approximately 6:30 p.m. Mayor counts will be prioritised. Referendum and polls will be counted on election night. The referendum will do a count of ballots received only.
They won't be sorted, Amber, to the yes and no on election night.
That's right, Diana. So we're just counting the number of ballot
Yes.
papers, accounting for those ballot papers in our venues. And all counting will cease at 10 p.m. on election night. No counting will be conducted on Sundays, though the Sundays will be used for other logistical operations. On the vote count information accordion on our website, you will find the schedule and location of the initial counts for each area and vote type.
Now, all mayor ballot papers undergo an initial count. The ballot papers are examined and sorted according to the first preference for each candidate, or they sorted into the informal pile. The informal pile will contain ballot papers where there is no first preference recorded, or the ballot papers that cannot be sorted to a candidate as they appear to be informal, or where the polling place manager is unsure how to sort. These will be reviewed during the check count, and the final formality will be determined by the computer count system based on the preferences data entered. As mentioned earlier, the initial count of first preferences is an indicative count. The councillor ballot papers that have no group voting squares will undergo the same initial count process as the mayor ballot papers. The results for all initial counts will be progressively updated and published on the website. You can see an example of a mayor ballot paper and similarly a councillor ballot paper with no group voting square on our screens. There will be for the count process, there will be posted notes placed on the counting table for each candidate and the informal pile. Ballot papers are then examined and sorted according to the first preference for the candidate, which those ballot papers will be placed below the posted note, or they'll be sorted to the others, including informals, which will contain all the informal ballot papers and those where the election officials are not sure how to sort. The ballot papers then will be counted into bundles of 50, the results recorded and published on the website. All the ballot papers will be data entered at the check count, where the final formality is determined by the computer count system. The councillor ballot papers with group voting squares are sorted according to the first preference vote for each group that has group voting square above the line, to the first preference for the ungrouped candidates, and for the candidates that are in a group with no group voting square. They will also be sorted to the others, including informal pile. This pile will contain the obviously informal ballot papers and some formal ballot papers, Amber, as well. And that's on purpose because on the night we can only do, it's an indicative count, the initial count. So this pile will include the ballot papers where a preference is for a candidate that is in a group with a group voting square, or ballot papers that are marked both above and below the line.
And Deanna, we do receive a lot of inquiries about this, so it's important to note that this is just that initial count, but every ballot paper will go through that data entry process, which we're going to talk about.
And it will be sorted, correctly to the correct candidate or group.
That's right. Now, on the screen, Deanna, we have an example of a councillor ballot paper with group voting squares. And you can see the different sections of that ballot paper. We've got the above the line section where the group voting squares appear. And you can see a group voting square for group A, C and D on the ballot paper. We then have the line that separates the two sections of the ballot paper from above the line to below the line. And then the below the line section where the candidates are displayed for each group and the ungrouped column. Group B has no group voting square on the ballot paper. And then the far right column is the column of ungrouped candidates on the ballot paper. And now we're going to discuss how the initial count is conducted for councillor with group voting squares on the ballot paper. On the screen, you can see the different sorting cards that will be used to determine the first preferences for each group with a group voting square, each ungrouped candidate, each candidate in a group with no group voting square, and then all other ballot papers will be placed in the others, including informals. All the ballot papers will be data entered at the check count, where the final formality determined by the computer count system. Deanna, would you be able to walk us through that initial count sort?
Yes, we have a question, Amber. When will we know if a ballot paper initially in the informal others pile has later been counted for a candidate? So during the check count, as soon as the data entry process has completed for a venue or a vote type, those vote results will be published to the website progressively. So that's how they can compare the initial counts to the check count figures.
And every ballot paper will be data entered?
Every ballot paper will be data entered, and the results of the check count will be progressively published to the website.
Okay, excellent.
Now, the ballot papers that have a number 1 in a group voting square will be sorted to the red sorting card for that group. There will be a red sorting card for each group with a group voting square, so we can see in our example that the ballot paper that we have, there are 3 groups with group voting squares. The ballot papers that are marked below the line for ungrouped candidates will be sorted according to the first preference for each candidate. The ballot papers that are marked below the line for a group with no group voting squares will be sorted to the first preference for each candidate. In our example, Group B doesn't have a group voting squares, but they have candidates below the line. The ballot papers marked below the line for the groups that have group voting squares in this election will be placed in the others, including informals pile, together with the obviously informal ballot papers and ballot papers where the election officials were unsure how to sort. Again, all the ballot papers will be data entered at the check count, where the final formality will be determined by the computer count system, and the results of the check count progressively will be published to the website.
Referendum and polls will undergo an account of ballot paper count only on election night. They will not be sorted to a yes and a no at this time, and we've touched on this briefly earlier today, Deanna. The initial count of referendum and polls will be conducted in the weeks following election day at the relevant count locations, including the returning officer's office and our centralised count venues. All counting will cease at 10 p.m. on election night for the work, health and safety of our staff. Polling place staff will pack down the polling place and return their material to the returning officer's office. Any counts that are not completed on election night will continue on the Monday following the election in the returning officer's office. No counting will be conducted on election Sunday in any venues. And just a reminding, we are taking questions today and we'll be responding to them using slido.com. Please use the hashtag LG elections to ask your questions. Now, Deanna, moving on to the check count process.
Now, the check count commences in the weeks following election day, Amber, and all mayor and councillor ballot papers undergo the second count, which is the check count. The ballot papers will be simply counted into bundles of 25, and they will go to data entry into the computer count system in 2 rounds by 2 different operators, followed by a reconciliation process. The check count is the official count used in the distribution of preferences to determine the elected candidates. The check count is conducted at either the returning officer's office or the centralised count centres.
And Deanna, people can see where that check count's being conducted on our website.
That's correct, Amber. The mayor ballot papers, the mayor distribution of preferences is conducted using the optional preferential system, and that system is described in Schedule 4 of the local government regulations. The instructions on the ballot paper for mayor is to write the number 1 in the square next to the candidate of the choice. Then you can show more choices if you want to by writing numbers in the other square starting with the number 2. To be elected in the optional preferential system, a candidate must receive 50% plus 1 of the total formal votes in the count. This is called an absolute majority. To arrive at the final first preference votes, we've already said that the ballot papers undergo an initial count, which commences on election night, Amber, and the second check count, which commences from Monday after election day. Now, to calculate the absolute majority, we determine the total first preference formal votes. That number is divided by 2 and we add 1. In our example, the total first preference votes is 8,756 divided by 2 and add 1. Absolute majority at first preferences is 4,379. So a candidate in our example would need 4,379 to be elected at this point.
Okay.
We don't have any candidates that reached absolute majority, Amber, in this example.
So what do we do now, Deanna?
So now we exclude the candidates with the lowest number of votes, and in our example is candidate D. So we take the ballot papers of candidate D and we distribute them according to the second valid preference, number 2, to the candidates who have remained in the count.
Okay.
In this scenario, when we've excluded candidate D, candidate A is received 250 votes, candidate B received 441 and C 87. We can see that candidate A is still ahead of candidate B, however, did not receive absolute majority, therefore not yet elected. And it's important to note, Amber, that the absolute majority is recalculated at every count. It reduces as we lose ballot papers to the exhausted pile. They're the ballot papers that have no valid preferences on them. So in this exclusion, we've recalculated the absolute majority, and it's now 4,323.
And we still don't have any candidates at 4,000. At that new absolute majority of 4,323, Deanna.
Therefore, we exclude the candidate with the lowest number of votes. In our scenario, that's candidate C. After the exclusion of candidate C, candidate B now has achieved absolute majority and became ahead of candidate A, and therefore candidate B is elected.
So at that second exclusion, Deanna, we calculated the new absolute majority?
We calculate absolute majority again, and we determine the elected candidate.
Thank you. Now, the distribution of preferences for a mayoral election will be conducted from Monday the 30th of September. The mayoral distribution of preferences cannot be conducted prior to the close of postal vote return deadline, and that's 6 p.m. on Friday the 27th of September. The schedule of the distribution of preferences will be published on our website. Candidates and scrutineers are welcome to attend. The distribution of preference simply involves the returning officer pressing a button within the New South Wales Electoral Commission's count system, which will then distribute all of the preferences. The final results following the distribution of preferences will be published on the New South Wales Electoral Commission's website.
Now, in the election of councillor, the proportional representation system is used, and that's described in Schedule 5 of the Local Government Regulations. A candidate is elected if they receive votes equal to or exceeding the quota. However, candidates can also be elected without receiving a quota in this count system if the remaining number of candidates in the count equals the number of vacant positions. We can see on the screen now how voting above the line on a councillor that has group voting square amber translates on the ballot paper. So by placing a number 1 above the line for a group, the voter has voted for that whole group of candidates in the order they are listed below that square, starting from the top. So number 1 in group C translates into votes 1, 2, 3, 4 for those candidates below the line for that group. And number 2 in the group voting square above the line is translated into 5, 6, 7, 8 for those candidates in group A in our example.
Now, Diana, can you please explain how the votes are counted if the elected doesn't indicate a preference above the line and only puts their preferences below the line?
But the preferences below the line are counted exactly as per the voters' markings on the ballot paper.
Okay, thank you.
Now, a candidate is elected if they receive votes equal to or exceeding the quota. How's the quota determined? It's determined by dividing the number of formal first preference votes by 1 more than the number of candidates to be elected. The quotient is increased by 1. In our example, there are 3 councillors to be elected. 356 first preference formal votes divided by 4 equals 89 plus 1 gives us the quota of 90. The quota doesn't change through the count, unlike the absolute majority when we in an optional preferential count for mayor.
So the quota in this instance remains the same throughout
the whole
process.
The whole count DOP process, yes. Let's go through an example of distribution of preferences under the proportional representation system. In our example here, we have, after the first preferences, count 1, 1 candidate reached the quota, and therefore they were elected.
And what do we do next then, Diana?
Next, we need to transfer their votes to the remaining candidates. So in our example, the candidate has a surplus of ballot papers over the quota. This surplus will be transferred to the continuing candidates. So all the ballot papers received by the elected candidate are then sorted according to the next preference. Each ballot paper is then worth a portion of that surplus.
And what do we do with the surplus?
Okay. The surplus.
Have I gone too
So we'll get to how to calculate the surplus, Amber, in a minute. But let's distribute all these ballot papers. In our example, when we distribute them, candidate B received 20 ballot papers, C received 40 from candidate A, D received 30, and E received 10 ballot papers.
Okay.
Those ballot papers have now a transfer value. So to calculate the transfer value, we need to determine that transfer value. So we divide the surplus by the first preference votes received by the elected candidate, minus the exhausted if there were any. In our example, we have 10 votes that are above the quota, that's the surplus. We divide it by 100, that's the total votes for that candidate. So our transfer value is 0.1 in this example. Now we apply the transfer value to the ballot papers that were received by each candidate during the transfer. You could see that candidate B received 20 ballot papers. Multiply the 20 ballot papers by the transfer value of 0.1, those 20 ballot papers equal 2 votes. So candidate B is now with 84 votes.
Okay, so we can see that, Diana, below the candidates on the screen there.
That's right, yeah. Again, candidate C received 40 ballot papers from the transfer of candidate A, and multiply the 40 ballot papers by the transfer value 0.1, that equals 4 votes for candidate C, which gives him a total of 79 votes. And we continue so on, multiplying the transfer value by the votes to ascertain the number of votes each candidate will keep at this transfer. Now, following the surplus transfer, if another candidate reaches the quota, Amber, then they are elected, and any surplus from that candidate is similarly transferred until all surpluses have been transferred. If we don't have candidates elected or transferred to distribute, we commence the exclusions. So if all surpluses have been transferred and the vacancies remain, the candidates then with the lowest number of votes is excluded, and all their ballot papers received by this candidate are transferred to the remaining candidates according to the next available preference. The surplus transfers and exclusions continue in this manner until all vacancies are filled or until the remaining candidates equal the remaining vacancies, at which point the remaining candidates are elected, and that would conclude the count for councillor. Can I just mention something, Amber, that it's important to say that this description of the proportional representation count is a very high level. The count is much more complex in details, and we can only present a high level snapshot of the count.
Now, Diana, as you say, this is a high-level walkthrough of that count, but we do have more information available to candidates or participants on our website, and there's also a counting and results section in the handbook, which will go into further detail.
Yes.
Now, like the mayor distribution of preferences, the councillor distribution of preferences cannot be conducted prior to the close of postal vote return, which is at 6 p.m. on Friday the 27th of September. Any councillor candidate elected as a mayor will be ineligible and will therefore have their preferences distributed.
And Amber, it's also important to note at this point, so where we have a contest and a candidate has nominated for both a mayor and councillor, we cannot conduct the councillor distribution of preferences until the recount deadline for a mayor has passed, which is 24 hours after the declaration, after the count has been conducted for mayor. So that's why we see a little bit of delay in the conduct of the distribution of preferences for councillors, because they also have mayor candidates.
Yeah, it's an important point, Diana, but you can visit the website. We will have the schedule for the distribution of preferences, and we also mentioned that the mayoral counts will be prioritised prior to the council accounts. Yeah. Now, the distribution of preferences is the same as the mayor. It simply involves the returning officer pressing a button within the New South Wales Electoral Commission's computer count system, which will then distribute all of the preferences. We anticipate this will take 5 to 10 minutes to occur.
For each council.
Yeah, or for each contest. And we will be conducting 5 distributions of preferences every 15 minutes through that period across the state.
Yeah.
Any candidates or participants who do have inquiries should contact the New South Wales Electoral Commission's Candidate Help Desk. The Candidate Help Desk is now open and will be open from 6:30 a.m. till 6 p.m. on election day, and will be open through all the counting processes. A recording of this webinar will be available on the website shortly. Now, there are a number of counting and result resources which we have touched on throughout today's webinar, Diana, but in addition we do have an explainer video on how the counting works, and that goes into further details again that some people may find useful. And we also have that candidate handbook, and we do encourage scrutineers to attend the polling place manager briefing on election day before the counting commences. And if you do have any queries, please do not hesitate to contact the Candidate Help Desk. Now, Diana, we have got some questions that have come through for us through today's webinar. Who supplies the vests for the scrutineers?
The person responsible of in charge of the count process at the time. Mm-hmm. So is a polling place manager or a count manager in a count centre, or returning officer in the returning officer's office.
And it is important to note, and we have mentioned it, you do need to make sure your scrutineers attend their venues with their appointment of a scrutineer form. They will need an appointment of a scrutineer form for each venue they may be attending, and they will be issued the vest, but they'll be asked to return that when they're leaving the venue, and then when they are appointed to another venue, they would be subsequently issued another vest.
And if they return the next day to the same venue, Amber?
The form will be held at the venue, and they will be given or reissued their vest on arrival at that venue. Now, Diana, why does a group not have a voting square above the line?
So they don't have a square above the line. Either they did not qualify to have a square above the line because they didn't have the correct number or the right number of candidates in their group, mm-hmm. or they chose not to.
And I think the only other instance that a group may not have a group voting square is where the group may have requested a group voting square on the ballot paper, but there was only one group on that ballot paper, in which such they're not entitled to have that group voting square.
Yeah.
Are candidates' preferences submitted in pre-poll and postal votes available to view on the New South Wales Electoral Commission's website before election day? Now, Diana, no voting starts before 6 p.m. on election night.
No, that's correct.
So we won't be able to see any results on our website before 6 p.m. on election night, and the counting will only start at 6 p.m. So we don't envisage you'll be able to see anything on the website before about 6:30 p.m.
That's right.
Can you please confirm if a candidate can scrutineer for another candidate?
I think, Amber, they not in the same area they're contesting.
That's right. So a scrutineer can be appointed, and a candidate in one council area may appoint a candidate to scrutineer another area, but they're not able to scrutineer the contest for which they are contesting the election. But we can go through that in more detail if you'd like to call us, and we can walk through the specifics with you. If the pre-polling booth is also an election day polling booth, will the pre-polling votes be counted on site or at the returning officer's office?
At the returning officer's office, the pre-polls, Amber, only the votes taken on election day will be counted at the polling place on election night.
Yep, and all of the pre-polls will be returned to the returning officer's office. I think there's some centralised venues.
Yeah, there are some exceptions where we're helping the returning officers because they have a higher number of pre-polls. We're taking those votes from the returning officer to a centralised count centre, but these will be indicated on our website for the information of candidates and scrutineers.
And Deanna, I think it's important to note that not all pre-poll venues will be counted on election night.
No, it's impossible to count all the pre-polls on election night. So the returning officers will determine, depending on the capacity, their capacity and space availability on the night, and those pre-poll centres that they determine they'll be counting will be published on the website again for the information of candidates and scrutineers.
Thanks, Deanna. Now, Deanna, we've mentioned the formality will be checked by the computer count system throughout today's webinar. Where can somebody find the formality rules applied by the system?
The formality rules are on our website. I think they are also in the candidate handbook and AMBA.
Yep. And our first count numbers entered into the EC system on election night.
Yes. Yep.
So the count will be conducted in our polling places, and then they will call through, or our returning officer's office, and those initial count results will be entered into our election management system. It's a different system.
Yes, from the data entry system.
To the computer count system, but they will be entered. The polling place managers calls those results through, and then they'll subsequently be displayed on the website.
Yeah. But it's important to note, and yes, it is a different system. Mm-hmm. The system that receives the initial count results is different to the system where we undertake data entry of all the preferences.
Yeah, that's right, Deanna. Where a councillor candidate is also a mayoral candidate and they are successfully elected as mayor, do 100% of the councillor votes go to the next in the group?
If they are the head of the group, yes.
And is there more detail on that in our handbook,
and
Diana?
how the transfer is done? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. What's the latest dates the results will be available on the website after all the votes have been counted? So the distribution of preferences are scheduled to be conducted between the 1st and the 3rd?
30th of September. That's after the close of return of postal votes, which is 6 p.m. the 27th. So the first DOP will be conducted on the 30th of September, and we estimate that the final declaration of results will occur by the 3rd of October, Thursday the 3rd of October.
And can you please explain the difference between ordinary votes and declaration votes?
Ordinary votes are when the elector turns up and vote on election day or at pre-poll, where the ballot paper is placed directly into the ballot box. The declaration vote is where a ballot paper is placed into an envelope, and that envelope is subject to scrutiny before the vote is accepted. So a postal vote is where the ballot paper is placed in a declaration in a postal envelope, or an enrolment vote is a declaration vote where again the ballot paper is placed in an envelope.
Yeah, so an enrolment vote would be issued at a polling place or a pre-poll venue if the elector is not on the roll or has recently moved, and they're able to provide that proof of identity when voting. And as Deanna mentioned, they will be put in an envelope, and both the postal and the declaration votes will be processed at our centralised venues. Now, I thought you were going to say something, Deanna. Does a scrutineer have to be of a voting age and a citizen? As in, do they have to be on the electoral roll, Deanna? Now, Deanna, can I tell you, for a local government election, there is no restriction on the age of a scrutineer. It's important to note that the scrutineer does need to be appointed by a candidate, and that they turn up with their appointment of a scrutineer form for a voting centre. Just another question's come through. Can a scrutineer hand out how to vote material if they're outside a voting centre and not wearing a vest? Yes, so in the instance you have somebody outside of a voting centre, distributing electoral material or the how to vote material, we actually refer to them as candidate workers, and a candidate worker does not need to be appointed. Now, it's important to note that your candidate workers do need to be greater than 6 metres from the entry of our voting centres. They're not able to distribute material within the 6 metres to the entry of a venue, but they do not need to be appointed as a scrutineer. As such, they will not be issued a vest to distribute electoral material.
So during the day, in the morning, I can just come in, distribute how to vote material, and if I want to observe the count, for example, in a polling place, I present my scrutineer form then, and I get issued my vest and card. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. So if you're coming in to oversee the counting, yes, you're to turn up and with your appointment of a scrutineer and subsequently be issued your vest. We have had a webinar on candidate workers and scrutineers, which is available on our website, and you'll also see any of those questions that may have been asked through that webinar. Now, Diana, I think we've reached the end of our questions for today, but if there are any questions that do come to mind, please do not hesitate to contact the Candidate Help Desk and we will respond to you. We have one final webinar in the series for the local government election that will be held following the conduct of the election regarding the post-election disclosures. And we do encourage you to register for that webinar, and that's now available on our website. We would like to thank you for joining us, and Diana, thank you for helping me walk through counting and results today.
Thank you, Amber.
We do hope you found today's webinar informative. Thank you.